Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give people a few more minutes and then we'll get going. Thanks for your patience. Welcome to the Affordable Homes at Risk webinar. We're just going to give people another minute or two and then we'll get going. Thanks for your patience. All right, out of respect for all of you who've tuned in here on time, we are going to get going with the Affordable Homes at Risk annual webinar. My name is Matt Schwartz, and I'm the CEO of the California Housing Partnership. And we have a terrific group of panelists here and presenters who are going to be giving you an overview of the homes that are at risk and illustrating how preservation work is happening in at least two communities in two very different ways. And then we're going to be moving on to talk about policy solutions. Before we do that, I just want to acknowledge that this work that we do, and in fact, the whole history of the California Housing Partnership stems from the work that low-income advocates, low-income renter advocates have done. We wouldn't exist as an organization but for a dedicated group of low-income renter advocates who in the late 1980s pushed hard at the state level to create a separate entity, a non-governmental entity, a private nonprofit that would actually provide the technical expertise and policy leadership outside of state government that they felt they needed. And I want to recognize in particular the National Housing Law Project, who is represented here today in one of our panels, for having played an instrumental role in that. And that struggle really informed who we are today. I joined the partnership 21 years ago after working with the partnership to preserve more than 3,000 affordable homes in San Francisco, having heard the work that they had done in other places. So while people may know us more today for the work we do on housing, affordable housing production or housing policy work or research, which you'll hear about today, or even decarbonizing affordable homes, our root story is in helping low-income renters preserve their homes and working directly with low-income renter groups. And it's important that I know we remember that regularly. So I also want to acknowledge that the work the partnership has done has historically focused on preserving subsidized affordable homes. That is, those homes that received assistance and were regulated by local and state governments. Enterprise Community Partners has done a lot of leadership in recognizing the need to provide technical assistance and policies to preserve the portion of affordable homes that are actually not already regulated or subsidized. And so in a way, they're a co-host with us today, and you'll see several enterprise folks here. I also want to recognize Beyond National Housing Law Project, our sister agency, Housing California, with whom we work closely on all the policy and funding leadership that we'll be talking about later. And the two presenters of our case studies today, the Housing Authority of San Luis Obispo and also the Unity Council here in the Bay Area will be presenting for you. So I think today you're going to hear a variety. We're really kind of living up to our name. We are kind of both a do and think tank. And we really want to connect the dots here between what's happening on the ground to save people's homes and then what's happening in Sacramento to make sure we actually change policies to support that work. So for our first panel, we're going to turn to actually our first presentation. Danielle Mazzella, if you could have the next slide, please. And Danielle has been is senior research manager and has been leading our team's work for many years in making sure that we are doing everything we can to preserve subsidized affordable homes. So Danielle, I'm going to turn it over to you to start us out with the findings from this year.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, so good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Matt said, I'm just going to go over some key highlights from our most recent at-risk report. For those of you who are familiar with work, we update this annually to produce new numbers by county so everybody can kind of see what's going on in their locale. As part of our work, we maintain a statewide database of federal and state subsidized rental homes and incorporating locally restricted developments as we are able. Given details on ownership and affordability, we're able to assess the likelihood of these developments converting to market rate. Here you see there are more than 550,000 subsidized rental homes in California, with more than 3/4 of them being financed by the low-income housing tax credit. Nearly half of these homes are concentrated in Southern California, represented in the darker blue, specifically Los Angeles County, which has almost 140,000 affordable homes. We also see large concentrations in the Bay Area and in Sacramento, Fresno, and Kern counties. Next slide. Before we dive into what is at risk, it might be helpful to contextualize what has been lost. This chart shows the number of homes lost each year by funding agency. You can see in the far left between 1999 through 2023, California lost more than 19,000 affordable homes due to expiring regulatory restrictions and owner decisions to opt out, sell, or allow their properties to convert to market rate. From 1999 to 2008, more than half of these 19,000 homes were converted during this 10-year period. A large number of these being subsidized by Housing and Urban Development, HUD loans, and project-based rental assistance contract, represented in the chart in the fuchsia color, predominantly on the left and middle. During the same period, we also see the start of the loss of first-generation low-income housing tax credit developments, shown in light blue, as many of these only had 15-year affordability covenants. Moving to the right side of the chart, we see a large increase in the last 8 years in the number of redevelopment funded and other locally restricted homes, represented in the teal color, lost affordability. In addition, we see another wave of tax credit developments lost as these only had 30 years of affordability instead of the 55-year regulatory agreements we're accustomed to today. Next slide. Here we show what is at risk over the next 10 years by program. Our database not only includes the previously mentioned HUD tax credit and local programs, but also includes farm worker and multifamily developments created by the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, through the Section 514, 514, and 521 programs, as well as loans and grants from the California Housing Finance Agency, CalHFA, and California Housing and Community Development Department, HCD. Our risk assessment primarily relies on the length of the existing affordability agreements or restriction and ownership of the development. Developments at risk are those that may convert to market rate over the next 10 years. Low risk means there is more than 10 years of affordability left on the development, or it is owned by a stable, mission-driven nonprofit organization. In the map on the right, we see homes at risk are concentrated again in Southern California, the Bay Area, Sacramento, Fresno, and Kern counties in the darker shades of green, and represent 3/4 of all at-risk homes. Counties with the lowest concentration of homes are in the North State and Sierra regions, here in the lighter green, but have some of the highest proportions of at-risk developments. In some of these counties, the loss of 1 or 2 developments would significantly impact the ability of lower income renters to find other affordable homes, as there may only have been 10 or so subsidized developments in the entire county to start with. Next slide. When we assess risk, we further break it down into 3 main categories. Very high risk developments are those that may convert to market rate within the year. High risk are those that may convert in the next 1 to 5 years, and moderate in the next 5 to 10. Of the nearly 34,000 affordable homes, more than half are restricted and/or are assisted by HUD loans or project-based rental assistance. Of most concern are project-based rental assistance contracts that are renewed for limited terms, either 1 or 5-year contracts, and finding strategies to preserve these and maintain affordability of the 40,000 homes otherwise subsidized by HUD. At-risk developments with regulatory agreements through tax credits or local mechanisms are a growing portfolio of what is at risk, as many of these only had 30-year affordability terms, represented as the light and dark blue sections of the stacked bar charts. The light green you see represents USDA-funded developments with prepayment provisions that give owners the option to apply to prepay at any time, as well as older USDA loans that are nearly at the end of their mortgage terms. Lastly, more than 1,600 affordable homes funded through state agencies, CalHFA and HCD, are also at risk over the next 10 years, shown in the dark purple. We have seen the success of recent programs like the Portfolio Restructuring Program in preserving these developments, and hope to see more successes through new preservation funding and tax credits, so these 34,000 homes can remain affordable. With that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Matt Alvarez-Nissen.
All right, thank you, Danielle. Hi, I'm Matt Alvarez-Nissen, Senior Research and Policy Associate with the California Housing Partnership. And I'm going to be talking about our recent report on the unsubsidized affordable housing stock. This is the second year we've put out this report using private market rental data to understand the scope of unsubsidized affordable housing across the state. So first, before I get into our findings, I want to talk a little bit about what unsubsidized affordable means. Many of you might know it by a different name, naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, but these are properties that don't receive any government subsidies or aren't subject to regulation for whatever reason, whether it be the building's age, its size, location, etc. But they have market rents that are affordable to a lower income family. In our report, we're specifically looking at properties where at least half of all units are affordable to households making 80% of the zip code median income, where affordability refers to a household paying up to 30% of its income on rent. We've been collecting this data annually from CoStar since 2020 and have been tracking affordability across the state since then. You can go to the next slide, please. An important caveat about these properties is that while we know a lot about the physical building and the rents that are charged in it, we don't know a lot about the makeup of the actual households. So it's entirely possible that moderate income and above moderate income households are living in these properties, although the rents are affordable for lower income households. It's also worth noting we're only focusing on the multifamily stock, so the 5+ unit properties. Due to data limitations, we don't have access to the 2 to 4 unit properties, the duplexes, the triplexes across the state. But we know based on existing research that it's likely a significant share of the unsubsidized affordable housing stock is also in these property types as well. And we hope to capture this subset in future research going forward. Now, turning to our findings, we found that just over 820,000, we found over 820,000 existing unsubsidized affordable homes across the state. And you can see compared to the subsidized housing stock, which Danielle just talked about, it's significantly more. However, both the unsubsidized and the subsidized housing stock still don't meet the needs of the 3.5 million low-income renter households across the state, leading to exceptionally high rates of rental cost burden for low-income renters. Next slide, please. So again, before we look at where this unsubsidized affordable housing is at risk of being lost, I do want to turn our attention backwards to see where it has been lost since 2020. So this is a map by county of where unsubsidized affordable housing has been lost between 2020 and 2023. We found just over 160,000 affordable homes lost their affordability during this time period. And again, unsurprisingly, mostly concentrated in Southern California, as well as the Bay Area, as well as Sacramento and Fresno counties. Another point that's mentioned here but not explicitly shown is that the majority of lost unsubsidized homes were located in higher opportunity neighborhoods per the TCAC HCD opportunity maps, whereas only about 40% of remaining unsubsidized homes are in similarly resourced neighborhoods. And so the continued erosion of this stock is both a challenge to affordability, but also represents a serious affirmatively furthering fair housing challenge as lower income households are denied access to opportunity through the housing market. Next slide, please. So now looking at where existing unsubsidized affordable properties are at risk, we found just over 220,000 homes are currently at high or very high risk of losing affordability in the near term, so the next 2 to 3 years. We estimate risk based on a census tract's unsubsidized affordable housing risk index. We derive this risk index from a number of factors, including both neighborhood and property specific factors. And since we've collected data over time, we can track the typical patterns of affordability loss and continue to project out how neighborhoods may continue to experience loss in the near future. Again, like the loss map, unsurprisingly, the highest concentrations of these at-risk homes are in Southern California and the Bay Area. Next slide, please. Taking a deeper dive into where at-risk properties are located, splitting it up by county, we can see, again, a visual representation of that concentration in Southern California, especially LA County, as well as the Bay Area. Again, Sacramento and Fresno see a significant share of the at-risk unsubsidized affordable homes. However, the map on the right shows the share of all unsubsidized affordable properties in the county, which are at risk of losing affordability in the near term. Again, the story changes significantly here with disproportionately higher levels of risk in smaller and inland counties, especially in the Lake Tahoe area and along the coast. This is in part due to the limited multifamily housing stock in many of these counties, but it also shows how market pressures come to bear in these smaller regions and smaller markets in a way that is different from a larger region like the Bay or LA County. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. And I just want to acknowledge we have some great questions now in the Q&A. And to answer the last one from Bruce Wolf, yes, we will record this and make it available later date. Matt Alvarez-Nissen, I'm going to ask you if, just so we can stay on schedule, if you would answer the first 3 questions there that relate to your presentation by typing through the Q&A. And we're going to then go ahead and move on to the next part, the next panel. And to help us with this part, I'm going to turn it over to Heather Bromfield, Senior Program Director, Preservation Enterprise. And again, a big thank you to Enterprise for co-anchoring this whole event and particularly lending expertise on the unsubsidized portion. Heather?
Hey, thanks so much, Matt, and thank you, Danielle and Matt, for your really excellent research detailing the need for preservation. Enterprise in California is very concerned about the numbers on the loss of our affordable housing stock and is deeply committed to preservation as part of a 3Ps strategy for affordable housing, production, preservation, and protections. We work with the nonprofit housing groups and public sector agencies that are doing this really critical anti-displacement work to try to find ways to scale up the work. So in that vein, I have the pleasure of introducing representatives from 2 of these housing groups who are going to share some of their experiences in undertaking different kinds of preservation projects. Our first speaker is Ken Litzinger, from the Housing Authority of San Luis Obispo, who's going to be talking about the Anderson Hotel, a subsidized property, and that was at risk. And the second panelist is going to be Aubrey Levine from the Unity Council in Oakland, who's going to be discussing the recent acquisition of a property in the an unsubsidized property in the Fruitvale neighborhood in Oakland. So with that, I will pass it off to you, Ken.
Thank you very much. So I'm with the Housing Authority of San Luis Obispo. We're a housing authority, and we also have an affiliated nonprofit. We manage the Housing Choice Voucher Program and manage about 2,800 vouchers. And then we provide property management to over 900 affordable units. The title of my presentation is Twice Saved. So the Anderson Hotel was built in the 20s, and it was built as a high-end hotel for travelers. And in particular, I guess we understand a number of guests to the Hearst Castle would stop here and spend the night, and then the following day would go on and be guests of the Hearsts. The property fell into hard times. New owners bought it and recapitalized it. And they obtained a HUD project-based rental assistance contract. And in that process, they converted it to 68 units of low-income housing, specifically for the elderly and disabled. However, we understand that the rehab process that they undertook in the 70s there didn't go as intended, and the contractor got partway through, absconded with a bunch of the money, and then left the area, and then left the property as it was. So in the 90s, the owner was done with trying to manage this under the project-based rental assistance contract and was getting ready to opt out. And our community recognized at that time it was such a significant need for the type of housing and in this location. And so the Housing Authority agreed to step up and try to save the housing, but there was a major catch. The owner of this property would not sell. So they said, we'll assign you ownership through a 20-year lease, but you're responsible for everything. And then he assigned the HUD contract to us. So for approximately 20 years, the Housing Authority tried to keep up with this very old building, significant capital needs and challenges, and keep the property afloat. And so we did our very, very best. There were times where our organization said this property could put us into bankruptcy. And it reached a crisis point during the 2008-2009 Great Recession, where our funding under the HUD rental assistance contract was slashed dramatically. We found a way to survive, and then but we were getting near the end of our 20-year lease, and the owner notified us, hey, we don't want to participate in this process anymore. We're selling it, and actually we're under contract with a market developer who wants to take this property, fairly quickly relocate all the tenants elsewhere, and then they're going to turn it into high-end condos and a boutique hotel. So we tried to make several offers to purchase the property and we were just unsuccessful. The owner just did not want to work with us. And so the countdown began and we shifted our efforts as a housing authority from trying to preserve the asset to protecting our tenants, right? Some of these tenants have been with us for 15, 18 years. And now, they were hearing that they were going to be displaced, permanently displaced. So the countdown began and we really thought we had run out of options. And when we had basically given up, DFDO with the CHPC connected us with the housing law project, National Housing Law Project. And they quickly alerted us that they not only our tenants had very specific rights under state law, but qualified nonprofits had very specific rights under state law that for a property to convert from affordable to non-affordable, that there was a process where qualified nonprofits could actually match an offer and receive, first right of refusal to purchase the project. But so National Housing Law Partnership, they connected us with the HCD preservation team, and we tried to salvage this project. We ran into a difficulty though. So despite the law being on our side, it seemed like at that point that the state preservation law lacked enforcement mechanisms. So even despite us becoming aware of these rights and actively going forward and these notices going to the owner's like, we're selling, we're under contract, and continued to go through that process. And then further, legal action was directed at us for trying to preserve the action for interfering in private market enterprises. So we were in a tough situation. So just fast forward, we were 2 days, as I recall, 2 days away from the escrow closing from the owner to this market developer. And from the combined efforts of HASLO, National Housing Law Project, CHPC, HCD, and others, we were able to get the sale suspended. And so that was a huge victory. And once we got that in place and the owners realized the weight of the legal responsibility that was out there and we were about to bring to bear, negotiated in good faith and allowed us to put in a matching offer on this property. And we obtained site control under, an option. So we celebrated as a group and a team, and then we're like, what have we gotten ourselves into? So the more we learned about this building, the more we learned, hey, the plumbing, some of this was done in the 70s, and then the rest there's infrastructure sections that date all the way to the 20s. And we needed to raise approximately $55 million to buy the property and do the substantial seismic and infrastructure upgrades that were needed. And then we had 68 units of housing for a very fragile tenant. These were elderly and disabled individuals. How are we going to find 68 units of housing in our very tight and very expensive rental market in San Luis Obispo? And so those were just two of the major challenges that really came right as soon as we got done celebrating, had to pivot towards saying, how are we going to attempt to pull this off? And so we quickly learned that all of our various partners had different noticing requirements for our tenants. HCD had a set, the HUD contract had a set, on and on and on, and we had to attempt to work through that. So we worked on trying to finance this and raise the $55 million that was needed. And we developed a strategy with the team, National Housing Law Project, CHPC, and others, in that we would apply for home key funding for the site acquisition and to help with the relocation of tenants. And then a number of local sources, but the key block would then be we needed to apply for tax credits. We ran into a substantial issue where ACD and HomeKey had guidelines around preservation and around applying and receiving these grants that didn't necessarily line up with tax credit guidelines. And So it was a very, very tenuous situation. And I'd like to just give a shout out to Mark Stivers, who helped a number of times. I remember in one situation, Mark, where you said, I helped write these regs, here was the intent, and trying to get those to line up between the various funding entities. And then we had commitments from Homekey, the city, the county. Congressman Carvajal's office even got us $2 million written into the federal budget process. And we were getting close, but then the sequence of events came very close to disrupting the project, where the owner was saying, we gave you an option, but unless you close this time, we're moving on and you forfeit. And then versus HCD had said, hey, if you close on this property too soon, we have to apply all these regulatory agreements, then which would keep us from applying for tax credits as a preservation project. So it was very tricky. We ended up working through the details, but we had to do 2 closings. One to buy the property and acquire the property in February 23, and a second closing in April 2023 to close and start construction once we'd had the tax credit award in place. And I know I'm moving quickly, we could spend a whole session on this, but I would just like to point out, if you go back one slide, the finish line is in sight for us. So construction will complete in September. We'll begin moving tenants back in October. And this project on the other side is going to be 66 units. It's a TCAC tax credit special needs project. 40 of those units are Homekey homeless assistance units, so specifically for the homeless. 10 are tax credit special needs units, and then we have 16 units that are income restricted, and then 2 on-site managers units. The other big component of what we were able to achieve was we're providing major supportive services. We just built that upfront into our operating budgets, and so that's the other big success story that we have been able to build in this project. Not only maintaining it, putting 55-year regulatory agreement on the property, but budgeting in upfront very, very extensive supportive services for our residents. So we feel like it was a major miracle to be to this point where we are soon notifying tenants that they can start planning on moving back into this residence. And again, some of these tenants have been with us 15, 18 years. And so we're looking forward to reestablishing this community right downtown.
Thank you so much, Ken. That story is a wild ride, and I congratulate you all on the work that you've done to make that happen. I should have just mentioned at the beginning, if people have questions for Ken or for Abra, our next panelist, that you all should put them in the Q&A, and we are going to have some time for Q&A at the end of this panel. So thanks again, Ken, and Abra, I will pass it off to you whenever you're ready.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And thanks, Ken. That was interesting indeed. Good morning, everyone. As Heather mentioned, my name is Abra Levine, and I'm the Vice President of Real Estate Development at the Unity Council. And I'm excited to be here to share a bit about the Unity Council's preservation work. Despite a brief hiatus, the Unity Council has been active in real estate for the better part of our 60-year history. We work on new construction projects, adaptive reuse, commercial and community projects, and most recently, preservation. As a community-based organization, we're unfortunately painfully aware of the negative impacts that institutional landlords and the loss of affordable units has on our community's ability to retain stable housing, and of the unsafe conditions in which many of our clients reside. So in 2020, the Unity Council acquired a 3-building portfolio in the Fruitville neighborhood of Oakland, totaling 80 units. 2036 Ave, the subject of today's discussion, is the largest of the 3 properties of 55 units. So although the previous owner boasted that he hadn't raised rents in 20 years, the property had serious deferred maintenance needs, had been the subject of a successful habitability lawsuit, and was a known nuisance on the block. After we purchased the property, a city inspector actually and thanked us for doing so, and several others, because it had been such a problem. On the upside, it had a massive courtyard, on-site parking and laundry, and was fully occupied by low-income families, many of whom were Union Council clients. To many investors, the extremely low rents would equal major upside potential and a great grab. Our ability to acquire the property and keep it off the speculative market prevents displacement by ensuring that existing tenants can stay housed and that the community doesn't lose a valuable affordable housing resource. Next slide, please. So the first phase of the project, acquiring the site and completing some necessary life safety improvements, including a full seismic rehab, cost approximately $12.3 million. The second phase, an upcoming rehab, will be roughly $4 million. So compared to our new construction portfolio, the funding stack is remarkably simple. For the acquisition and initial rehab, we had debt totaling $3.8 million, or about $68,000 per unit, through the Bay Area Preservation Pilot Program. An equity investment, which we brought in as mezzanine debt to preserve the 10-year acquisition roll in anticipation of applying for tax credits down the line, of $3.3 million, or about $60,000 per unit. And soft debt from the city of Oakland of around $5 million, which and almost $200,000 in sponsor equity. For the rehab, we'll leverage another $2.5 million from the city, about $1 million in energy incentives, different rebate programs, and hopefully about $500,000 in HP funds. And I should say that, as is the case with most rehabs, with more resources, we could do more. But this is what we're working with. In total, we're spending less than $300,000 per unit, including public soft debt of roughly $136,000 per unit. Next slide, please. So, as any developer in the room could tell you, rehabs are inherently challenging and risky. And these types of acquisitions are that and more. We got into contract on 2000 just as the global pandemic was heating up. This made due diligence quite interesting. Tenants and inspectors alike were wary of in-unit inspections, so we were forced to extrapolate conditions from a small sample size and rely heavily on tenant photos. Imperfect information that could never have identified the major issues we later discovered inside the walls, under the floorboards, and in the roof joists. We knew the building was in bad shape, but we anticipated a tax credit rehab that would generate sufficient resources to address the need. Less than a year later, the tax credit regulations changed, and that hope, at least for the short term, went out the door. The experience highlights, unlike portfolio rehabs, where developers have years of data and staff and resident experience to rely upon when identifying rehab needs, this type of preservation work is like looking at the tip of an iceberg and trying to come up with a realistic estimate of its size. The few funders that are at the table to support preservation work want to participate on the front end, helping to take units off the market. But it can take time to adequately uncover the true needs of a property, and there's even less funding to address this need. Another challenge, which may not be emblematic of all preservation projects, but that we did and are unfortunately still dealing with, is inaccurate documentation from the previous owner with respect to operating expenses and tenant information. It really wasn't until we got to know the residents and were able to access all of the units that we realized that many of the leases we had received from the seller prior to acquisition were just wrong or represented smaller households than the ones living in the units. The larger households have a huge impact on unit wear and tear, operating costs, and overall health of the property. Finally, getting the first filing for our welfare tax exemption approved, which in new construction projects often takes about a year, took about 3 years and almost $1 million in property taxes that we advanced, only to now be refunded. Much of the delay can be traced to inconsistency and confusion around income certification documentation and conflicting requirements between the city and county related to the same. In addition, since many of the tenants pay well below the restricted rents, there's almost no incentive for existing tenants to opt into the income certification process. Next slide, please. But for all the challenges, there have been some positives. So first and foremost, we've been able to keep people housed and are working hard to improve the safety and security of their housing. We've had a consistent management presence at the property, and tenants are feeling more empowered to share maintenance needs in their units and participate in efforts to improve the property as a whole, because they realize that our management team listens and responds and in a timely manner. We've also been able to positively impact the residents' quality of life through a multifaceted approach focused on improvements to the building and shared spaces, programs to address physical health, reducing stress on mental health through safety measures and right-sizing living environments, and providing economic development, education, and opportunities. We've been able to leverage relationships with nearby nursing schools and referrals to existing uni council programs to bring much needed healthcare and financial literacy and assistance programs to the property. And through a partnership with the Learn Play Foundation and Ripple, we were able to transform the courtyard into a vibrant community hub, which the residents designed, and now includes a playground, community gardens, shade structures, and a soccer field. Overall, I hope the approach underscores that as a place-based community development corporation, we understand that the real value of the preservation work that we do is the people who call this property home, and the impact that bringing stability, resources, and promise can have in uplifting these households, and by association, the community surrounding them. Thank you. Back to
Thank
you.
you. Sorry, thank you so much, Abra, and congratulations on the excellent work you all done on this property in Oakland. So we are going to do a very abbreviated Q&A just to stay on track and leave enough time for the policy solutions discussion. But I will kind of tee up a question related to that, which is, I'll ask you first, Abra, based on your organization's experience, what is one state policy solution that you would propose to the policy panelists based on your experience here? And Abra, sorry, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, Heather, can you repeat that?
Sorry, no worries. Yeah, just a state policy solution that, based on your experience, you would propose to the policy folks who are about to speak.
I mean, I think the biggest thing for us was the was the welfare tax exemption issues. It was incredibly costly, both from a financial standpoint, but also, from staff time, and has frankly impacted the organization's appetite to continue doing this work. So I think that alignment and clarity regarding the welfare tax exemption process for these types of housing or for this type of preservation work is really important moving forward.
Great.
To pick one.
Yeah, and as many people on this call probably know, the welfare tax exemption is handled at the county level by each individual county assessor's office, but so that leaves some, I think, discretion and there's different policies that might at the state level be able to, could potentially influence the direction that counties move on the welfare tax exemption. So, Ken, I'll pose the same question to you.
So a couple things from our experience would be to try to align the various state programs when it comes to preservation projects, where you don't run into an issue where you may be preservation on the HCD side, but depending on how it goes, you might not be considered a preservation project under the tax credit, guidelines. And so aligning some of those would be extremely helpful. And then the second thing, I guess, when a developer is trying to preserve affordable housing in some manner and has taken the step to acquire it, I don't know if there's a way to offer a warning when there's changes in the regulations that might, like Barbara had mentioned, the plan is to buy this property and do tax credits, and then there's a change in regulations that prohibit that. And I don't know how exactly you solve that, unless, right, if it's acquired, maybe those projects are grandfathered in. But there's been a couple other times where we have looked at maybe getting involved in preservation. We're saying, well, the risk is high. If we acquire the property, drop all this money, and then there's a change in regulations that put us in a position where we can't do the needed work.
Right, yeah. Great. Well, thank you both so much. We have a couple questions in the chat. I believe that we're actually going to try and answer these in writing rather than in real time, so that we can pass off to the next panel. So if those questions are for each of the panelists, I'll invite them to respond to those directly. But thank you so much, Aubrey and Ken, for both the amazing work you're doing and for presenting here today. And I'll pass it back to Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather, Abra, and Ken. We could each take an hour on the stories that you've raised and the different implications for how to make preservation work better and easier. And to pick this policy discussion up, I can think of no one better than my colleague and friend, Shioni Lucina Munoz-Fliegel, who runs Housing California. And Shioni and I work together regularly on all kinds of policy and funding challenges. And in addition to running Housing California, she has her own deep expertise in this field from her time managing the housing work at PolicyLink prior to coming to Housing California. So Shioni, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure being with you all today. We're thrilled to see so many of our partners engaged in this conversation because we know it's a really important part of the work that collectively we need to do to actually solve our state's housing challenges. We have a great group of speakers today who are going to build on the last panel and really dig into some of the statewide work and thinking that's happening around policy solutions. We have Mark Stivers joining us from the California Housing Partnership. We have Leila Giti-Satani from the National Housing Law Project. We have Emil Leaño Atanasio from Enterprise Community Partners. And we have Andrew Dawson joining us also from the California Housing Partnership. As I mentioned, we're really going to kind of ground this part of our conversation in the solutions that many of our organizations are championing at the statewide level. We'll be talking a little bit about things that have already transpired or happened that are opportunities you all can leverage. And again, we'll have some time at the back end to take a couple of your questions and be in dialogue with you all. We can go to the next slide. Sorry. Hopefully I don't lose my voice during this. One of the things that we all heard in the last panel was really how challenging it is to actually fund this work. So we're going to start off. I actually want to turn to Mark first. And I'm asking you, Mark, if you can share some of the proposals that advocates and elected leaders are working on right now to advance support for our preservation work. How are we thinking about funding this work? What are the opportunities that folks on the call can be kind of plugging into and helping to elevate in the statewide conversation?
Thanks, Shioni. As most of our listeners here are surely aware, the state is undergoing a pretty significant budget deficit. And so getting funding through the budget in the short term is proving to be very challenging and troubling. We have our hopes focused on a housing bond for the November 2024 ballot. And specifically, that's Assembly Bill 1657 by Buffy Wicks from the Alameda County. And this bond currently is written to be for $10 billion. Of that $10 billion, 70% would go for the multifamily housing program at the Department of Housing. The multifamily housing program often funds new construction, but it also prioritizes the preservation of existing at-risk affordable housing. So we've been talking today about two classes of properties. Both those are existing affordable housing that can convert to market rate, and then buying up unsubsidized housing. The multifamily housing program can do quite a good job with the existing at-risk affordable housing. The bond also has a preservation category, though, and within that $1.5 billion preservation category, there is roughly $500 million for a new program that Amiel will talk a little bit more about, known as the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program. But essentially, that money would be available for the purchase of unsubsidized housing and bringing that into the affordable housing fold. So that's really what we have been speaking to mostly right now, is how do we find money to do these acquisitions? And that's where we think our best hope is. The one other thing I'll talk to here on this slide is that, as I think Ken mentioned, getting a seller to be willing to work with an affordable housing buyer can be a real challenge. Other types of buyers can close faster. They don't have to try and get the money together. But what we've been advocating for some period of years now is an incentive for the sellers to work with nonprofit affordable housing organizations. And we think the best way to do that is to provide them some tax relief. Most sellers of properties have held it for a long time. Most of them have pretty significant capital gains. So when they sell the property, they are subject to both federal and state capital gains taxation. And we think that if we were to basically cover 50% or up to $1 million of their capital gains, that would be a great incentive for them to work with our types of buyers. We have run legislation on this in the past. AB 1911 by Assemblyman Gabriel of 2022 is our last attempt at this. We will come back and do it again. We're just waiting for a time when there are some resources in the budget that would allow us to offer this tax credit. Thanks, Shioni.
Thanks, Mark. I might ask you to say a couple more words if we can go to the next slide. Can you talk a little bit about kind of state preservation notice law and some of the conversations that are happening right now around that?
Actually, I think I'll turn that over to Layla if you don't mind.
Okay.
I'll jump in as needed, but Layla?
Thanks. Yes. So this year, the partnership and NHLP are sponsoring a bill, AB 2926, that's going to expand the state preservation notice law. So currently, California has a really strong preservation notice law that requires a notice to tenants 3 years, 12 months, and 6 months in advance of when a property is going to lose its affordability. And as a part of that law, there is also a notice of opportunity to submit an offer to purchase for preservation purchasers. So what this law is going to do, this bill, is it's going to require that owners either accept an offer from a preservation buyer or restrict the development as affordable housing themselves. There is also some technical clarifications that the bill has as well. Matt, Mark, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, just that, the main problem has been with the law so far is that the developers have been making offers and the owners have just been wanting to hold on to the property and convert them. And by kind of changing the choice that they either have to accept the offer or re-restrict the property as affordable housing. We think most offers will take the sale option and sell it to our buyers. So we're very gung-ho on this legislation.
Thank you for jumping in there, Layla. I'm going to come back to you in just a minute, but maybe if we can go to the next slide. Camille, I'd love to have you talk a little bit about the work you all have been exploring that's really trying to answer the question of how we facilitate the acquisition and rehab of naturally occurring affordable housing as a way to grow our supply of permanently affordable housing. Can you talk about the work you all are doing on the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program and why Enterprise introduced this proposal that many of us are really excited to see?
Great, thanks, Shioni. So as mentioned, Enterprise is one of the co-sponsors of SB 225, which is the current vehicle for the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program, otherwise known as CAP. California Housing Partnership was really a close partner in crafting this program and this proposal, and Housing California is one of our co-sponsors for that bill as well. So one of the main motivations for introducing CAP is to really think about how we could scale preservation. So CAP does seek to establish a statewide preservation funding program to allow mission-driven affordable housing organizations to purchase these at-risk, unsubsidized affordable homes and essentially take them out of the speculative market. And the CAP does have or has had a parallel budget request of $500 million. We've been really thinking about what kind of resources could bring this model up to scale. But of course, given recent budget challenges, we've really looked to the affordable housing bond as proposed by Assemblymember Wicks that Mark had mentioned as one of the main funding vehicles for that. And essentially CAP would provide short-term acquisition capital and long-term subsidy through a single streamlined program that really draws from a lot of lessons from local preservation programs that have existed and we've engaged in. And also a small portion of funding for CAP as well is intended for technical assistance in building organizational capacity. So different orgs who might not have had experience with preservation have the tools and technical expertise to actually carry out that model.
Thanks, Emil. Layla, we're going to come back to you. You started talking about some of the work happening around preservation notice law, but can you share what other tools exist to ensure that tenants know about the work that's happening and are protected throughout the process? Are there other policies or practices we should be considering to ensure that preservation efforts serve existing low-income residents, that they actually help the folks that are there benefiting from those homes today?
Yeah, and for tenants, the notice law is really the biggest kind of tool in the toolbox because it allows them to get notice far ahead of time. So they're not scrambling, when the time comes when the affordability restrictions are expiring. So notice laws provide tenants with advanced written notice when the affordability is ending. This gives tenants an opportunity to prepare for the changes and get involved in preserving the property by reaching out to agencies, local officials, attorneys, and forming tenant associations. And without proper notice, it's really hard to preserve a property because not only are the tenants displaced, but the entire community as a whole is impacted. So it can't go unsaid how important notice law is and proper early notice. So there is also federal notice laws for those properties that have federal affordability programs as well. And then additionally, we have our state notice law, which I described earlier. And in some cases, there are replacement subsidies, but those are very few and far in between, and it's only for very specific programs. So the notice law is really kind of the main tool for tenants so that they can rally and preserve a property. And in terms of looking in the future and what kind of programs could help tenants. So California has this great tool with the notice law, but one thing we could be doing better is building partnerships. So there really is kind of a space, at least here in California, to build informed and responsive local collaborations with federal, state, and local agencies, nonprofits, community service organizations to identify preservation opportunities and to ensure enforcement of the protections that we already have. So some key components of these types of partnerships could be early warning systems to preservation advocates and local governments and other collaborators and key agencies with transparent data about all affected properties and notices, and kind of having a table where tenant advocates, legal aid, local, state, and government, federal governments can kind of join the discussion to evaluate the data and with on-the-ground analysis, because sometimes the data doesn't tell you truly what's happening on the ground with the tenants or what the owner is intending to do, and kind of coming together to create those action steps to move forward. So, we have this great law, but we really need to enforce it, and we really need to come together with all the organizations that are trying to preserve properties so that we can create these early warning systems and make sure that we are spending our time on the properties that can be preserved for the future.
Thank you. Andrew, let me come back to you. Our last panel talked a little bit about some of the work they're doing to decarbonize buildings through their preservation efforts, and also spoke to the challenging funding landscape for that work. Can you talk about some of the resources that are available to actually do the decarbonization? I know there are a number of federal programs that have made funds available that you've been looking at. What resources should developers be aware of or be trying to leverage?
Yeah, thanks, Shioni. There are a lot of state resources. I want to touch on a couple of them, as well as some of the new funding that's coming out through the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. So the first one is called the Low Income Weatherization Program. The partnership helps administer that program. So feel free to connect with me or our team to get more information about it. But this is a comprehensive retrofit program for energy efficiency. And a lot of existing buildings already qualify for the program if they're serving low-income populations. And you can get anything from solar to heat pumps to a lot of different appliances through that program. The other two I want to really highlight is the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program. This is a program that the CEC is building out. We hope to have money available starting next year, but this will cover 100% of expenses. So a lot of issues that we see with programs, they only cover part of the retrofit or part of the appliance or anything like that. This program will cover 100% of the cost, including installation. And there's also going to be health and safety and electrical panel upgrade costs that can be covered through the program. So that's going to be a really important program as we build out in the state. The other one I want to talk about is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which was from the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. This is $20 billion in 3 competitions for building financial mechanisms to for people to use to retrofit their homes. This money has just been allocated. Awardees have just been announced. Enterprise was one of the awardees for a couple of the competitions. And we're excited to see what happens there, as it is a ton of money that going into decarbonization that a lot of buildings can have. The one other thing I want to note is a lot of the state programs, like the low-income weatherization programs and the other ones that we help administer, offer free technical assistance. So if you get signed up through one program, we can get you technical assistance to all the other programs you might qualify for through the state, as well as some of the utility programs. And that technical assistance is really helpful in building out the scope, the design, as well as what programs you are eligible for.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the next question I'm really going to pose to all of you. So whoever's feeling inspired can go first in the response. But how should regional governments think about preservation needs, especially in counties that have the most at-risk properties that were illustrated in those earlier slides and from the partnerships reports? What would we offer to regional governments who are thinking about preservation?
Maybe I can jump in on that one. So one thing we do have is that state housing element law requires every city and county to sort of do an analysis of at-risk properties in their community and kind of have a bit of a plan for addressing that. I would say that that's good for listing where the problems may come up. It's the plan part is the part that probably could use some elaboration and some greater resources. And I think, you know, many cities and counties don't have a lot of housing staff. I think having at a regional level, addressing this at a regional level is probably more effective and more efficient. And so take, you know, we have now the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, or we have an LA Housing Financing Authority. Some of these more regional entities could really develop some expertise in this topic area, hopefully have some resources, whether through a bond or some other measure, to be able to act quickly and nimbly and help us purchase the at-risk properties. I think that's where regional governments could really excel.
Yeah, and I think if I can go back to what I said earlier about creating kind of local partnerships that are really on the ground is extremely helpful. When local governments are tracking these types of properties, when they are in touch with the owners and they know what is happening on the ground, that's really helpful kind of moving forward, because it can allow them to act fast when the property is at risk. And they know where to put their resources, because certain properties may be renewing their subsidies and may not need the same type of looking at as other properties that are actually going to be potentially opting out of these programs. So having kind of an early system on the ground and fostering the relationships with other key stakeholders that may be able to help and provide the technical assistance or the advice where it may come. But I think kind of having that built on the ground so that it can be put in place and be used when it's actually needed to.
Thank you. Amiel, Andrew, anything you want to add about local government?
Yeah, I think, enterprise is really focused a lot on trying to find or develop more resources for preservation. And as Mark kind of alluded to as well, really thinking about funding at the regional level could really help get to scale. And Abra alluded some of those pilots already with the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency with their Bay Area Preservation Pilot. And there is a proposed regional bond measure for the Bay Area that should that pass, a portion of that will go towards preservation activities as well. So thinking through what could be done at the regional level to actually provide financing and resources to carry out this work, especially given that there might be localities or cities that would like to do preservation but just aren't necessarily able to raise funding on their own as well.
Andrew, anything, or you want to wait for the next question?
I'll wait for the next one. I think all these were great responses.
Okay, so I'm going to open the next one up to all of you too, and maybe keep this as a power round for each of you to give us just a couple sentences in your response. But what do you think is an important solution for us to get to the next level of success with preservation? We've talked about kind of the stuff that we're working on right now, but as you think forward to the next step, what really stands out as important work for us to be prioritizing?
I guess I can go first since I didn't go last time, but at least in the way of decarbonization and electrification, I could think of two things right now. One being the mid-cycle retrofit. So these are things that are not year 15, kind of maybe year 5, year 10. Getting money for those retrofit in deed restricted affordable housings. That's really hard because you need a lot of soft financing for that. And you don't want to have any kind of hard debt because you have to re-underwrite all your deals, right? And so getting that to work is going to be very difficult, but I think there's a lot of hope, especially with the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program that I was talking about earlier, which covers 100% of costs. I think that could be a really good source for a lot of projects that are not applying for tax credits right away. The other thing is funding for health, safety, and upgrades. We know there's going to be a lot of electrical upgrades needed in a lot of buildings, as well as health and safety concerns that need to be addressed. And there's not a lot of funding for that side, especially in the decarbonization space. There is some, but we've been advocating to include a lot of that in our work. And I think a lot of the decarbonization programs are trying to hear us on that, which I'm really excited about.
Thank you, Andrew. Mark, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think where there's great potential is on the enforcement side that I think Leila was talking about a bit. The Department of Housing is responsible for enforcing the state preservation notice law. And what we're working with them on are efforts to really be more proactive in that. I think right now they're reactive. They hear complaints that someone didn't comply with the law. They look into it, they take action. But what we're really trying to do is get them to be, tracking which properties are coming up within their year of being able to convert to market rate, and then actively engaging the owners and making sure that they are providing the required notices and helping find people who to make offers on these properties. So that's where we're trying to get to between HCD and us, is kind of a proactive enforcement and engagement strategy, as opposed to, I think Ken was saying that, they got the sale postponed 2 days before it closed, right? We were very much reacting to fast moving events. And I think we could be much more successful if we came at this earlier.
Leila, you want to go next?
Sure, I think Mark stole my bit.
Oh,
We really
sorry.
we really have to work hard on enforcing our preservation notice law, but also not just thinking about the property, but thinking about the tenants who are there and what we can do to support the tenants, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be harmed. They're the ones that are going to be displaced. So making sure that in our approaches that we're not ignoring the tenants, their needs, and making sure that they are supported throughout this process.
Over to you, Emil. What do you think comes next?
Yeah, I think in addition to the resources, I think pairing those with COPA or TOPA policies, basically providing tenants or community organizations the right of first offer every time a multifamily building comes up for sale. As folks know, these unsubsidized affordable homes at risk are being sold off the private market. So they are competing with maybe other private entities that might have more resources. So giving mission-driven organizations kind of a bit of a leg up to kind of compete in that scenario would really be beneficial. And a version of a statewide COPA or TOPA bill was proposed last year under AB 919 by Assembly Member Calra. San Francisco already has an existing COPA policy as well, but we've seen in other places, especially DC, where this policy started of the benefits and how much of an advantage this could really be, and how much of a game changer this could be for preservation.
Wonderful. So we're going to actually pivot and open up for audience questions. If you have a question, we'll probably start first. Matt, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but start first with questions for this last panel. And then if we have a little bit of time and there are still questions for the earlier speakers, we can take those too. I did see a question in that was put in earlier and somebody responded to, but I think this was for you, Layla. Could you give examples of the potential challenges faced when trying to enforce some of the protection policies?
Yeah, I think sometimes the notices that go out get ignored, and so for all the people who receive these notices, the local governments, HCD, local legal aids, that they're not ignoring these notices when they come through, because it can really be an opportunity to get on the ground early and to enforce the law. And oftentimes, a lot of the contact doesn't happen till far, once we're really advanced into when the property might be opting out. And so sometimes just finding out too late or getting on the ground too late, having tenants contact legal aid too late. And so sometimes it's really just a timing issue. Also capacity, HCD's capacity, local legal aid's capacity. And so sometimes things can fall through the cracks just because we don't have enough people working on the issues, or even aware that there is this notice law and there is this potential in preserving the properties. So sometimes it could just be an education issue, it could be capacity, it could be timing. So those are some of the major issues in enforcement.
The one other question that was in the chat was around the foreclosure bill. Don't know, Mark, I see somebody answered it in the chat. I don't know if there's anything you want to say just so that the audience can hear about kind of the state of the work to provide foreclosure intervention and preservation support.
Hand that off into Amy L, I think. That's been part of the Stable Homes Coalition that he's been part of, I think.
Great.
Great, yeah. So the foreclosure bill they're referring to is the Foreclosure Intervention Housing and Preservation Program, otherwise known as FIP. So as Heather mentioned in the question, it was a nearly a $500 million program to fund acquisitions of also unsubsidized affordable homes at risk, either facing foreclosure or habitability concerns and issues. Where that program stands now, given the state of the budget, is that as of the May revision of the budget, there's a proposal to claw back those funds, since those funds have not been deployed, which is a bit unfortunate, because that would ultimately, should that pass, eliminate the FIP program. And that is something that many of our partners, especially the California CLT network, was really championing and relying on to make some acquisitions as well. But again, with the budget, nothing is final until ink is wet on paper at the end of June. So we'll see what call to actions, especially being led by the CLT network, could be out there. And again, these negotiations are very active and live right now.
Thank you, Emil. Before we close out this part of the conversation, I just wanted to emphasize a couple things that we talked about at the top. Kind of picking up where Emil just was, we are in the midst of our budget conversations, and many spending conversations get tied up in that, including the conversation around a bond this year. We are absolutely in the all hands on deck moment for that work. So if you haven't already, really encourage you to endorse the bond, to reach out to your legislators, to senators in particular, to tell them how important this funding is for our collective work. We can certainly share some links in the chat when I'm done talking to make that easier for you. We didn't talk a lot about it today, but we're also working to move forward an initiative that would lower the voter threshold on housing and infrastructure bonds. That conversation is a little convoluted in the legislature right now, but they do need to hear that that's a crucial issue for our community. It would allow local governments to raise much needed revenues for housing and preservation. So encourage you again to share with your members, with your elected leaders, with your partners, just how important that initiative is for our work. And then finally, in regions around California and the Bay Area and Los Angeles in particular, there are initiatives being put on the ballot that would generate significant new revenue for affordable housing. Somebody talked about BAFA earlier. There's a regional BAFA bond to bring billions of dollars to the Bay Area. LA partners are similarly organizing themselves to pass a new revenue measure. That is an important part of this work. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about it today, but certainly wanted to make sure we lift it up and emphasize just how important that is to our collective success. Any final thoughts from our panelists before I hand it back to Matt?
I'll do one, since Aubrey brought it up in her presentation about the welfare exemption. One of the things that she mentioned, among a few, was that they were paying $1 million in welfare tax exemptions, only could get them reimbursed at the end of the process when they finally got all the approvals that they needed. And we are running a bill with Assemblyman Chris Ward, AB 2353, that essentially would allow developers of all affordable housing, not just at-risk properties, but new construction otherwise, to withhold their tax payments while their applications are under review with no consequence. And so the idea is, instead of floating that $1 million for 2 years or more, and then just to get it reimbursed, we would not float that $1 million. And then at the end of the day, once all the approvals were in place, let's say there was some minor change in the application, we would pay whatever we owed based on the change, but otherwise we would never have had to pay that $1 million to begin with. And there would be therefore no need for a refund. So it keeps people from having to float huge amounts of money for a couple of years while their application's under review. And so we're making good progress with that bill this year. We have some ongoing conversations with the assessors and tax collectors, but it's more around the details than the concept. And I'm modestly optimistic. Never want to get too confident, but modestly optimistic we will see that enacted this year.
Thanks, Mark. Andrew, Miel, Layla, anything else before we sign off?
Yeah, for me, just wanted to point out that, preservation is still relatively new to some folks, especially some of our members in the legislature, and this education about preservation is ongoing, especially on the policy side. What I do want to point out that's interesting is Assemblymember Wicks recently conducted some polling on support for the state affordable housing bond measure. And what the polling found is that, first, there is really strong, robust support for a state affordable housing bond. But in terms of voter priorities, preservation was actually called out as a second priority among California voters. So a lot of folks are thinking about preservation, how they can preserve their homes, their communities. So would encourage folks to take a look at that and just keep talking about preservation.
On that note, I'm going to pass it back to you, Matt, and thank the wonderful panelists for sharing their ideas, priorities, and ways for us to keep this work moving forward.
And thank you so much, Shioni, for moderating, and for all the panelists. Just to recap again from the beginning, Danielle, Matt Alvarez-Nissen, thanks so much for your presentations. Heather, Ken, Abra for that first panel, and then this last great panel. So we're going to give you some time back for your, I hope, for a late lunch. And a big thank you to everyone who's showed up in this session today. And please do weigh in with policymakers on the importance of these issues and getting us resources to do more of the preservation work that Ken and Abra highlighted today. And thank you very much, and stay tuned for more from the Housing Partnership and our partners soon on these topics.